Well, I'm not going to introduce David to you. You perfectly know who he is, and if you don't, you have every opportunity to learn. I'd like to offer that the audience take active part in the question and answer session. So these are not going to be a formal question. You can ask any question that David has agreed to answer any of your questions, both regarding the situation in the corporation that he represents and across the board. David is not just a Google vice president. He's also a business person, a visionary, and therefore I would prefer that this discussion should become quite interactive. I'll be mixing up English and Russian, and I'll try to speak English when talking to David. So as far as questions are concerned, I guess I'll ask the first one, and then please prepare your questions, and we'll try to do it this way. So we'll talk a bit, and if when we get a certain number of questions, including those from the Twitter, let's intersperse them. So if you get questions during our conversation, we'll also try to use those.
Thank you, David. Just like a brief introduction, trying to make our conversation less of interview and more an open conversation.
Sure. Well, thanks, and it's great to be here. Is this on? Hello? Can you hear me? Great. Good morning, everyone, and it's great to be here and welcome you all to the Big Tent. Really happy that you came out, and I'm really pleased to be able to be here to chat about some of these really important issues. So, what would you like to talk about?
Okay. So, first and perhaps important issue, since you know I represent, national organization or national project at least, Skolkovo. I won't speak about Skolkovo much, but I'll try to skip it at all, but Arkady Dvorkovich already told about that as important it is for the country, but what is important for us, and specifically for my division, is how and what is your vision as a visionary, as a part of management team of Google Corporation? What is the future of internet and entrepreneurship in internet, internet as a business, and making offline business and internet, and how do you see this mix and shift of traditional business models into internet business models and so on?
Sure. No, I think it's a great question, and you know,
Хороший вопрос.
About where we are with the internet economy is that we're only at the beginning, in my view. You know, I think it was almost 14 years ago. It's 13 years ago is when I was a partner at a big law firm in Silicon Valley, and in walked Larry Page and Sergey Brin, and they said they had some search engine that they had built, and they were running it out of their dormitory room, and they said, well, we think we might want to start a company, and will you help us? And so I helped them set up the company that obviously is Google. And you know, that was a mere 13 years ago. And you see where Google has come, where the internet has come, in terms of its impact on economies, its impact on societies, its impact on culture. To be sure, there are issues that we have to grapple with, but no one can argue that the internet has not been an enormous force for economic development and for democracy and for freedom, quite frankly. And the great thing is that has all happened, and you've seen this impact with much of the development happening, you know, originally in the United States, spreading around, but still most of these, when you think of the name, I heard a number of names of companies mentioned. You know, you have Yandex, you have, you know, very important Russian companies, you have important Chinese companies and so forth, but most of the global companies have been American companies. That will not be the case forever, right? If there's one thing that I'm certain of, is that there will be many companies that are global companies that are serving folks all over the world, that are the equivalents of, you know, are the Googles of whatever country you might want to name, and I'm sure they will come from places you don't expect, and I'm sure that they will because it's all about creativity of the entrepreneurs. But if you think of the interconnectedness we now have, the networks we now have, the translation, right? The ability to do machine translation and other things to break down some of the barriers that we've seen historically. All that will fall away, and I think that we will have an enormous flourishing of entrepreneurship and companies across borders.
Okay, so next question, just to continue this topic. Are you guys, as a global corporation, looking for new Brins and pages, Sergey Brins and pages? And if you look for them, are you looking for them in order to move them to your headquarters or to your local premises, or global economies for you means something else?
I think we have, historically, in terms of running our business, we have development centers all around the world. So we've recognized that smart people are all over the world, and we want smart people to work at Google. So we have, including here in Moscow, we have a development center and engineering. And we also, as we've grown, we've realized that we want to be a part of these burgeoning entrepreneurial ecosystems, right, and startup ecosystems around the world, because the more that they take off and the more you see successful startups, successful entrepreneurs doing what they're doing in their countries, not coming to Silicon Valley to do it.
That's
I think the faster you'll see this revolution that I talked about in answer to the first question.
My question was a bit provocative, because
so I think that we're doing things like, for instance, we have an entrepreneurial outreach program. So we're working with startups all over the world, and with incubation type programs, with startup weekends, boot camps, you name it, and we're all doing this because we think it's a good thing for the internet ecosystem. One of the things that I also work on is something called Google Ventures that we do only in the United States. It's a venture capital arm, and we're investing in hundreds of companies, and we'd like to expand that internationally. We haven't figured out a good way to do that yet, but that's something we'd like to do. And again, that's with the premise of you can have successful startups that can generate a lot of value anywhere in the world, given where we are.
The reason I ask this question is very simple, because there is a common fear here in Russia that global corporations are just hunting for best brains, and that best people will be moving to some other countries, and Russia will be remaining without this human resources, first of all, which is most significant treasure of the countries of today.
Sure.
So and you just explained that that's not the situation. That business is global, and every point on the
global.
map.
I think people ought to have a certain amount of choice where they want to live, right? If they want to live somewhere else, that's great. But no, I think the fact of the matter is the networks are such, the creativity is such, the connectivity is, the connectingness is such that you don't have to move to Silicon Valley to succeed. And I think that will be increasingly clear over time.
Okay. So, my next question would be, there is no specific questions yet to you. My next question would be, you wanted to
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi.
So I can hear you.
There's been a lot of talk about the kind of internationalization and globalization of internet innovation. And
Can we find a microphone? Yes, please.
Yeah. How about a mic?
Thank you. Aram Sinreich, Rutgers University. So there's been a lot of talk so far about the globalizing internet market and this kind of argument that innovation is going to spring up from all around the globe. My question to you is, what do you see as the baseline regulatory and legal environments that are necessary for the homegrown innovation to actually take hold and thrive in the business community?
Yeah, it's a great question. The expected response from me would be something like hands off, right? Leave it alone. I do think that there was, sort of one reason why things took off in the U.S. and why we have some of these global internet companies is because the regulatory framework that sort of the U.S. adopted at the beginning was probably the right one. I thought, in terms of IP policy and sort of saying, yes, we're going to, we understand we have to protect intellectual property rights, the copyrights online, because the internet raises all these new questions, but we can do that in a way that still fosters innovation and lets these companies get going. Safe harbors, DMCA, notice and takedown. So that's an example. You have other examples where you just say, look, we're going to recognize that you have intermediaries who are not the publishers of content, but are our platforms, and so we're going to be careful about trying to make the platforms responsible for the content that come over the platforms. That was actually quite important, and it's not actually something that's universal, right? You don't see that most places in the world. So I do think that a baseline regime that sort of tries to create balance, whether it's in IP, whether it's in privacy regulation, right? I mean, you want to have a regime that says, look, let's give users choice. Let's make sure that people aren't tricking users. They know what data is being collected. They have the ability to sort of control it and give the user that power. But let's not have regulation that says thou shalt not do X, right? And you sort of have a rule that says it's illegal to do that, even if the user wants you to do it, right? And so having those kinds of regulatory systems, a baseline system that says we're looking for balance between innovation, creativity, and protecting important rights, right? Which we've had, privacy rights we've always had, intellectual property rights. We want to protect those, but having that balance, I think that's the important thing.
Okay. So I'll keep going with my questions. My next question was about cooperation and interaction between large corporations like yours and government. We all understand that at some certain level of importance of the company, of the products for everyday life of citizens of every country, there should be some interaction, there should be some cooperation or synchronization in the positions between large corporation and government. We know different models. We're aware of various situations. Before we started, I went through your transparency report page and checked the number of complaints from various countries. So what is your position towards developing countries, towards Russia specifically, and probably at all, and what is the future of that cooperation? Is it positive or negative? Is it going to be permanent fight, or is it going to be beneficial to both sides, or is it a combination of both, or what is it?
Well, I think I hope it'll be positive, right? But I think that large corporations like us have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to our users to make sure they know what's going on. They know what's going on with the data about them, right? Information about them, and how they use services. They have a right to know what's going on when there's information that otherwise might be available to them that some government has caused to come off the web, right? And so we feel that it's very important that we make that transparent. There are governments that don't like this.
Oh, right? We're perfectly aware of it.
To be clear, and not the governments that you would expect that people always name as being unfriendly to the internet, but many European governments, the U.S. government, but we think it's extremely important because the internet is one of the most powerful sort of platforms and vehicles for freedom of expression and creativity that we've ever seen, right, in the history of mankind. And so I think it's very important that it stays that way. We have I don't know how much this is being, how much more attention is starting to be paid to this negotiation we're going to have at the end of the year on the treaties around the ITU, right, and the sort of the regulatory framework for telecommunications, and that's coming up for debate in December in Dubai. And so there's questions about whether the UN should now be involved in governing the internet, and there are lots of legitimate questions about, well, wait a minute, historically it seems like the U.S. is controlling internet governance. Shouldn't we shift that away and make it more multinational? But on the other side, people are saying, well, yes, U.S. has had influence, but really it's been a multi-stakeholder process, right, and without anyone being able to control it, and particularly not governments being able to control it. Maybe that's the right model for the internet. And so we're going to debate all these questions, right, over the next several months. And I think it's really important because we're either going to have a model where the openness of the web continues, that governments can't unilaterally sort of stop their citizens from being able to interact with other people, around the world, which is what the internet allows you to do, or we're going to have a model where the internet starts to get balkanized, right, and gets split up into different little local internets where it's very hard for you to go across borders and interact with others. So I think that's what. So I'm hoping that the future is positive. right? Because we're going to have you're going to have lots of companies that with users in many countries, right, and who have products. If you're Facebook, or if you're Twitter, or if you're it's Google with Google Plus, these are social products that don't really where your communities, not just people in your country, right? You're connected with people all over the world, right? And so how is that going to actually work? If one government comes in and says, well, we have some very tight rules, and you can only have your the community in one country and not across borders, and that's always been a problem with the internet. But we face a future, or we face the prospect of it becoming more of a problem if governments decide they're going to regulate this more aggressively.
Well, the next question, in more or less in the same direction, just mentioned the strong word of balkanization. And we, probably most of us, recall a recent interview of Sergey Brin to Guardian, when he addressed these strong words to your competitors, not to the governments, but mostly to your competitors, literally to Facebook and Apple, and convicted, in fact, them in kind of creating borders and right. Closing information and not allowing to entire world to get into that. So from your perspective, the future is entirely, absolutely 100% open, or there is a right for some certain communities, voluntarily to close themselves in some certain clubs or probably larger communities, and not allowing to anybody else to see them. So there is a kind of border, very fragile, very sensitive, but there is some limit between endless openness and private life.
Yeah, certainly well, you should always have your private life you should be in control of your private life, no question about that. But yeah, I think what Sergey was getting at here is you're seeing the rise of these closed models. The internet succeeded because of its openness. I think we see enormous user value and creativity, innovation, and so forth. So it's perfectly fine if a company decides to adopt a model where we're going to keep it closed and not really take advantage of, or not really have the kind of traditional openness that you've seen, and for users to say, hey, I'm going to opt into that model because I'm getting a lot of value from it. But I guess the concern is that are we going to be able to continue to build on if you're a user and you have your information and you have it in one place, don't you want to be able to take it to another place? Right, and I think in terms of having new services sprouting up that take advantage, that give the user more choice, I think we're better off with open systems. If you look at something like Facebook, there's a lot of taking information in, so all information goes into Facebook, it never comes out, right? And I think that it's in general it's good for the user to have more of that, the ability to take your information where you want it, and I think it's good. You're going to see more companies building on top of that possibility. So I think what Sergey is just talking about is let's make sure we're paying attention to the importance of openness as one paradigm, as an important paradigm going forward.
Okay. Would you like to answer some questions from Twitter, or shall we keep going? Because there is plenty of questions already in. They're scrolling all the time. You probably missed most of them already.
Why don't we take one from the audience?
Are there any questions here in the audience yet? A lot of ladies.
Right here in front.
Hello, Katerina Kotenko, Open University Skolkovo. Google seemed to be successful practically in everything except Google Plus. What do you think about it, and why has it happened?
I guess I dispute your premise. I think it's actually going pretty well. Lots of people, millions and millions of people have signed up for it, and I think that again, if you think of it as well, this is the Facebook competitor. Then you may have one vision of it. But if you think of it as making Google social, right, which is the ultimate aim, right, you should be able to do things you're doing on Google, whether it's searching or whether it's looking, using maps and using location, in your Gmail. You should be able to. This should all be social, right? There should be a social component that's built into that. And as you're increasingly seeing the different integrations, the different things that come into Google, Google Plus, that use the other services of Google, whether it's YouTube, and on that score, I think it's been very successful, and you're seeing more and more of that. So we think it's been incredibly successful, both in terms of its pure usage, and people signing up and using it, and as a sort of standalone service, if you will. But more importantly, it's made Google more social, and we're only at the beginning.
Well, and one more question about your approach and your vision about Google and digital content and content at all, and rights and content providers and creators of content rights. We all remember the strong words which used Rupert Murdoch and addressed them to Google, literally stealing my money and so on and so forth. So what do you think about this? There are some, several versions, and Murdoch
Sure.
at some point is also probably right, because he invests his money in producing content, and he expects the return on investment on selling this content. And there should be some consensus in this field too.
Sure. There's no question that if you create content, you should be able to benefit from it. I think that when you cut through the rhetoric, at the end of the day, it goes back to what I said about platforms, right? The platform is not the publisher. Mm-hmm. Platform, if there's a piracy problem on the internet, the tendency has been to go point to the platform providers, whether it's a search engine or a hosting provider or a social network, and say it's your fault.
Because it's easy.
When in fact all of those services discourage people from doing that. At the end of the day, if you look at YouTube, it's a great platform for content, and despite the initial controversy that we had around it, thousands upon thousands of content creators are using both traditional content creators from the traditional industries and new ones, right? Who sort of individuals, new companies are using YouTube to create content and to get to users and to monetize that content and make money off of it. We've always said that there are technical ways to deal with some of these piracy problems, and for instance, we have something called Content ID with YouTube, where if the content provider can give us a snippet of a video, we can when someone tries to upload the very same video, we can at least catch it. We can catch it before it goes up, right? And that's a technical solution that turns out works very well. All the big content producers, including News Corp, have opted into this and they use it, and I think it works pretty well there. So the key is to try to make it clear that these platforms are opportunities for content creators. Because if you take the other approach and say, well, if there's any piracy at all on the internet, or if anyone ever is putting content on unauthorized content on the web, we should shut down those sites.
So this is what they expected from you, basically.
Right. Well, that's what there was a debate. There was a debate about a law in the U.S. called SOPA that many of you, I'm sure, have heard about, and that's exactly what they wanted to do, right? And I think that wouldn't have served society at all to have that. There's freedom of expression issues, not to mention and innovation issues. So I think the right approach is, again, going back to having the balance of, yes, protecting intellectual property online, but making sure we have a regime that also allows for innovation and for more creativity. In other words, if you look at YouTube, there's now a platform where people are making a living as artists on a platform directly, not having to go through the traditional intermediaries, the big companies that want to that you used to have if you were a musical artist or if you were a filmmaker, et cetera. You can now use some of these tools to go directly to the audience, and a lot of artists are doing that now. So I think you want to make sure that those avenues are available going forward.
Okay, there is one question I'd like also to, I mean, coming from Twitter, a very interesting question to me personally too, because what we're trying to explain now to our young engineers and students, that there's nothing wrong to company to be run by engineers. Moreover, probably 50% of top 100 of Forbes are engineers one way or another. They first invented and they became businessmen. What's your position about that? You are, after all, businessman and lawyer.
I am not an engineer.
And you are working, that's exactly the point.
As is probably obvious to all of you.
Engineer's position is more or less clear about that.
No, look, people always make these things, either or controversies. Look, engineers build things, and I think it's great to have companies that are run by people who know how to build things and focus on building things. And that's what we've always tried to do at Google. That doesn't mean that we don't have business people in the senior management, business people all around who try to put business ideas around engineers. And by the way, a lot of engineers are really good business people, right?
Successful ones.
Yes, very successful ones, as you pointed out. So no, I think it's a good thing, because an engineering culture forces you to be data driven. Right, so engineers don't usually sort of react well to things that don't have data behind them, things that seem superstitious or based on some instinct or based on some kind of business school analysis about things that really isn't based on what's actually happening in the real world. So I think that's served us well, because whenever we make decisions, we first go to sort of, well, what's the science here? What's the data? What does the data tell us? How can we test before we actually roll something out broadly? How can we test it and let's get a little empirical evidence before we actually do things in a big way? So I think having a culture like that is actually really positive.
Okay, and let's take up.
There's another question here about does Google shift from web-based services to soft hardware and web, Google TV,
and
Google
famous Google glasses. We all would like to see them.
The Google glasses are very interesting. Yes, it's been a big project Sergey's been involved in. Look, I think that Google has never, we've been a search engine. We've provided lots of web-based services, but ultimately we have a broader mission of using technology to sort of serve the world, right? And if they're interesting, hardware products or physical products that we can push forward, I think we're going to do that. I think the glasses are an example. Google Glass is an example of something that could push things forward a lot in terms of wearable computers and being able to actually really know what's going on in your environment and using the web, in your everyday life. I think that's interesting. We have the driverless cars idea, for instance, which is actually, believe it or not, going very well. So I think there are things that we've always said we want to spend a small amount of our effort on crazy ideas, because some of those crazy ideas might actually amount to something really useful. But we haven't spent, we're not spending all of our time on it, so it's not going to really, it's not going to affect our core business. And so that's been, we've always sort of had that approach. And I think that will likely yield some things that, are not, in our traditional businesses, but which make a lot of sense. I remember at the time that we rolled out Maps, and then we bought a company called Keyhole that did the satellite imagery. And there were a lot of people who said, well, what is Google doing? They're a search engine. Why are they doing maps? Why are they buying, satellite imagery? Why does, and now I don't think anyone would say that, right? People think it's absolutely natural that Google is going to provide you with map information, location information. And I think, to the extent your sort of way into the world, the web or into the networks involves some kind of device, whether it's a phone, or something else, or glasses or something else. It's kind of, I think it'll be seen as natural for companies like Google to provide that as well.
That's exactly my question was. Do you guys expect this kind of gadgets or any new kind of gadget to be as revolutionary as a mobile phones used to be? You know, like 10 years ago, 15 years ago.
Well,
like,
we hope so.
15 years ago, we just recall it. 15 years ago, whenever we didn't see, or 20 years ago, mobile phones. Now it's hard to imagine our daily life without it.
Right.
So do you in Google believe that next technological revolution as a mobile provider will be somewhere in the area of combination of some gadgets and technology and software and Google technologies and Google?
No, I think the combination of Moore's law is still in effect, right? So computing, we're still expanding our ability or computing power at cheaper cost. So on the hardware side and the physical side, that's still true. At the same time, we're seeing computing power, related to that, our ability to sort of deal with more data, right, and figure out, make use of the data. I think, and more people just on the web, being connected to the web and connected to the network, and more of the information being connected and available on the web. So you put all those things together, it seems pretty clear that you're going to have game-changing devices that combine, whatever the advances in software, the advances in computing, and the advances in hardware, and I think it's going to be very exciting, and I have no idea where that's going to come from, but I'm certain that someone's going to build the new game-changing device. More questions, audience?
Probably some.
There's one over here.
Microphone.
Oh. Then the next one.
Alexey Ivanov, Skolkovo Foundation. Could you elaborate a little bit on the notion of freedom you mentioned before? I mean, internet freedom. There are a number of different threats identified. One from state censorship, another from companies like Facebook, and so building of walled garden. But there is one threat which is attributed to Google itself. It could be called like monopolization. Monopolization.
Mm-hmm.
In many spheres, we could see that some initiatives which were very, very positive and beneficial for others, when they grew up and become dominant, they start to produce some detrimental effects on the environment itself. And Google, as a monopoly to a certain extent, as a dominant player in internet marketplace, do you consider yourself, as your company, your development, as a little bit, a threat for freedom in internet? How do you deal with this, and what kind of approach you develop to not to become one of those threats for internet freedom? Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So to answer the primary question directly, do I see Google as being a threat to freedom? No. In fact, I think we're all very proud of what we've done to provide access to information, to help provide access to information in ways that have been freedom enhancing. And I think there's no question about that. I will argue with anybody here who tries to suggest otherwise, because I think the data on that is very clear and very obvious. And I think the same is true of many other web companies. As you get larger, you do have to, you do have a responsibility, right? We feel we have a responsibility to the world to behave in a way that focuses on the user, that's positive, right? And so we have to always make sure that we are, they're holding ourselves to a high standard, that we realize that we're going to make mistakes from time to time, and we realize that we'll be able to fix them, right? And learn from them. And I think that's what we do. We expect that people will have questions about what we're up to. So being transparent about that, being open to discuss the issues, being willing to, if regulators have concerns about something, to talk about them. All of those things are true, because I think it is true sometimes that there's companies that that kind of lose their way or get off the path of their mission. I don't think that's where we are by any stretch, but I do think it's important for everyone to hold us, to a high standard. I think that, people use words like monopoly and dominance and these kinds of things fairly loosely, I think, because, you have to always remember, how fluid, how open the internet is, and how ephemeral these sort of dominant positions are in reality. At one time, I think people probably thought, MySpace was dominant, right? You see how quickly these things, change. When Google started in 1998, everyone said, well, it's search, that's been done, it's over with, we have dominant search players, that will never change. Changed very, very quickly, right? So you see how dynamic the platforms are, and a lot of that is because, this is all by choice. If you look at what Google, yes, we've been successful. And sure, we have market shares in certain of our in search and some other things that are significant, but we don't. You look at sort of the Microsoft behavior from the past. What that involved was, yes, we've built good products and we've acquired a strong share, but we're also doing all these things to stop others from going to the market. And Google isn't doing that. People use Google because they choose to use Google every time, right? And they can very, very easily use something else. It's with a click, right? It's actually that simple. So you got to be careful about throwing those kinds of words around. But the general sentiment of your question, which is, do we pay attention to the impact we're having on the world? I'd say, absolutely. And we need to be very, very mindful of that, and we are.
Next question.
Hello, David. My name is Yanina Zelenova. I represent TV Center channel. And my question is the following. Is it easy for such big country as Google is to work in Russia? Because Russia is a country with many peculiarities, and in business in particular. So we are aware that we have a lot of corruption on different levels. It's a very well-known fact. And what are the main obstacles for Google in Russia? And are you going to overcome them in time?
Sure. No, I feel that we've been in Russia for some time. Obviously, we've had a search engine in Russia long before we actually had any in Russian, long before we had anyone on the ground here. But, we have a business here. We do development here. We have found that this is Russia's a great place to do business, and it's a competitive place to do business, right? And in our core business, Yandex has been a phenomenal competitor, and we work every day, very hard to compete with them and everyone else. So I'd say that this is we have had a positive experience in the Russian market, and we expect to be here for a long time.
Shall we take some questions from Twitter? Sure. Probably. There was an interesting question about intellectual property regulation issues in Russia and all over the world, and Google's approach to intellectual property.
Well, I think we covered this. I think this is the idea of can IP regulation affect the development of local web businesses? And I think that the answer to that is absolutely. One cautionary tale. I was before we bought YouTube, we had a product called Google Video. And Google Video was like YouTube. It was sort of user-generated content and so forth. And there was a video that some kids in Italy put up on Google Video that had some teenagers bullying another kid who turned out to be he was autistic, special needs kid. So as soon as we found out about that video, per our policies, we took it down immediately. In fact, the police came to us and they used the video to go find out who actually put it up, and because it was invading this kid's privacy and various things, right? But our service was just the intermediary. Obviously, we didn't put that on the internet. We didn't sponsor it. In fact, it violated our policies. We took it down immediately. Nevertheless, a prosecutor in Italy decided that he was going to prosecute not only Google, but individuals at Google who may or may not have anything to do with it. And in fact, put me, because I was an original director of Google Italy, which was an advertising company, had nothing to do with Google Video, of course, and some others who also had nothing to do with this video, on trial for invading this kid's privacy. And ultimately, we were convicted, believe it or not, bizarrely, right? It's on appeal, and it will not, we expect it will be overturned eventually. But if the law in Russia or anywhere else around the world is that a service like that is going to be responsible for everything that goes up, no matter how quickly they act to stop it or to take things down, how prominent they make their policies to encourage people not to do bad things, and how cooperative they are with the authorities if some bad thing comes up. If the law is that's illegal, you won't have any of those platforms. If that was the law, YouTube would never have gotten off the ground. Dailymotion in France would never have gotten off the ground. And Facebook, quite frankly, would never get off the ground, right? Because you'd be responsible for everything that anyone ever posted. So I think that's an example of whether you're talking about IP, copyright, or other things that might be illegal. It goes back to this balance idea. You have to, you want to make sure that you have the protections, but also the flexibility, so that you can have the platforms continue to innovate, because that's creating a lot of social value, and you don't want to cut that off. More questions?
Questions? Oh.
So my name is Katya Gaika of Skolkovo Foundation. So you were talking about the freedoms just now, and there are two positions, as I understand, from the article of the Guardian, the recent Guardian article. So there is a Google position that is all about free internet, and there is a Facebook position that is we protect the privacy, we do not open Facebook entries for the Google search. And so what's the development for you? So if the saying goes that internet wouldn't be able to develop and innovation wouldn't be able to come to life if the internet would be a closed deal like a Facebook. So, but we do have Facebook as of now, and it's closed for searches of Google, for instance. So what would be the natural development now? So will it stop innovation? Will you be able to find a way to communicate with Facebook and find a way to work together? So what's your position?
Yeah, no, I don't think I ever said that there would be no innovation if there are closed networks, right? Facebook has a model, Apple has a model, and they've chosen sort of not to have it open, but to have it sort of these more closed ecosystems. So I'm not saying that innovation will come to a screeching halt because there are companies that have, quite frankly, very successful closed models that users are opting into. It's just tragic to some degree that there's information that isn't that it would be better for users if that information was searchable.
And that's why there is Google Plus, right, as an alternative.
Well, there are certainly there are alternatives, but again, if you're a user, you'd like to be able to have your decide. Well, I want to use now I have to my entire network of people I know and care about, all of my information is in one place, and now it's there forever, and now I can't take it. It seems like you ought to be able to take it somewhere else when you want to, or share it somewhere else because it's yours, right? And so that's what I'm saying, and it would be better, and we'd likely have more innovation, right? If we had more of an open model across the board. That's all.
And just to follow up, and do you see yourself, cooperating with Facebook and Apple?
Sure.
Yeah? Sure. Any, joint projects so far?
Well, no, obviously we have a lot of a number of relationships with Apple. Right. Any of you are iPhone users know that you have lots of Google services on your phone. But sure, we've said multiple times that we'd be happy. We'd love to be able to get access to the information in Facebook and other places on the web that we currently don't have access to.
A short follow-up to Katya's question.
Sure.
Google complies to EU regulation on information about privacy issues. So if you are a EU citizen, you can address Google UK and they send you everything Google knows about you. Can I retrieve information Google knows about me in Russia? Can I retrieve but I'm not EU citizen. I'm Russian citizen. I see. You don't hear me.
Yeah, no, I don't think that we've designed our system. We don't, we have a system. Whatever information we're going to allow you to get, if you're an EU citizen, you can get if you live somewhere else. We haven't built
but if you're American, you cannot, because American regulation allows you to store this information and not retrieve it back to me.
Well, we can debate the details of this, but we basically have designed our transparency products and our user notice and our the ability to find the information across the board, even if it's more than the U.S. law requires. We're aware of that, but we've designed it because we want one user experience for everybody.
Okay, and the second question is about mobile operating system. Well, generally. Currently, this market is divided between three major players. You, Apple, and, the remains of Symbian. What do you think will happen next? Will there be another third player when Symbian somehow goes down?
Well, there already is. I mean,
do you think
two little companies called Microsoft and Nokia. So, I mean, that's as an example. So, look.
But still, it's a mere.
Well, but Android didn't exist, 3 years ago, or as wasn't in the market 3 years ago. So I think, look, like other technology markets, I think it's going to move quickly, and any incumbents, whether it's Apple with iOS or even the Android system, who think that this is going to be the world will exist in precisely the way it is right now, a few years from now, is probably wrong, right? So I do think there's still going to be a lot of innovation in that.
And what about Chrome OS?
What about
Chrome OS?
Chrome OS. Same thing. I think we're seeing, we've got Android is a great example of an open source operating system. We think Chrome is a different instance of that will work for different kinds of applications. But we're very bullish on it, and we think that having this kind of choice in operating systems for these new platforms is really great, right? And it's a big departure from the past of what we saw with the PC. So we think it's good for users.
Okay, we're running out of time, so we have time for one more question probably after this one.
Thank you. John Gossier here from MetaLayer. So you talked a bit about innovation and how it's affected by products that are open and that are free, and how policy affects that as well, how policy affects the openness and the ability for people to innovate. Do you see policy then becoming those sorts of decisions related to openness becoming a competitive advantage for countries to create platforms for their citizens to innovate and create new businesses and so on?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. I think that countries that adopt restrictive policies, right, that close down avenues for folks to innovate are going to be at a disadvantage. There's no question. And countries that sort of recognize it and say, okay, we've got some social problems we need to deal with. We want to address, child protection. We want to make sure that our content creators are protected online. There are a lot of things we want to do, but who set it up in a way that sort of provides some flexibility, I think, are going to be ahead of the game, no question.
Okay, and the last one. Anybody? No questions. Oh,
one more.
Here it is.
I would like to continue the social responsibility part of your activity in Google as a general counsel. Could you tell, please, what's your attitude to these Google bombs as a problem? Do you feel that Google as a company should be responsible to look through information indexed in your engine and consider some of those informations as a kind of antisocial, criminal? Are you familiar with this Google bomb as an instrument for
Sure.
for manipulation? Like how far you're going to go in scrutinizing results of indexing, or it's not on the table at all. You know, you don't consider it.
No, I think our approach has been to deal with these things algorithmically, and at the end of the day, the Google bombing problem hasn't turned out to be a large problem. It's relatively rare, and it's examples that when people notice them, people take them for what they are. So I don't think we want to avoid sort of manually going in and adjusting the search results. And from time to time, we figure out some algorithmic things that sort of reduce some of the some new practices that we see that where search results aren't that useful. And so we've done that on a number of occasions, but we haven't found that that we've needed to address that problem. We've needed to do anything manually.
Okay, as we see, our time is over. Thank you very much, David.
Well, thanks, everyone.